Good evening.
Good evening.
I might open your Bibles to 1 Samuel 17. 1 Samuel 17. We'll be there in just a moment or two. 1 Samuel 17. As Joe said, we're going to talk about the story of David and Goliath. The reason we're going to talk about that is because one of my favorite songs that I grew up singing in Bible class was "There Once Was a Little Boy David," right? Mostly because of the round and round and round and round section. That part's just fun. Just as a side note, one time my wife and I were writing thank you cards for all the gifts that we got. And my wife's hand was tired of writing, so she had me write one of the thank you cards, which was for the blender. So I wrote the person, "Thanks for the blender. I like watching it go round and around and around and around." And I'm not sure she let me send that card or not, but how you get out of doing jobs you don't want to do, right? So, we're going to talk about this story, and I want to talk about it kind of in three phases. One is we're going to tell the story. I want to try to tell the story in a way that kids will get it, kids will understand. I'm going to have lots of pictures up on the board for the kiddos. And then I want to spend some time talking about some of the connections in the story for our a little bit older kids, and then we'll stop and do some applications for our adults, and just kind of grow in maturity as we go through the lesson today. But as we get started talking about David and Goliath, I'm going to start with a song that's not one that we normally sing, but it's David and the Giant to the tune of Pop Goes the Weasel. That might be hard to see. The words are, well, if you can read it, sing along with me to the tune of Pop Goes the Weasel. If you can't read it, you understand if you don't sing along with me. But there once was a giant who wanted to fight God's chosen people. All were scared and wanted to hide. Then out came David. David was a small shepherd, but he trusted God. He took the sling and 5 little stones. Down fell the giant. I was going to add a food. I didn't know who. I don't know. But that's what the story is an exciting story, right? That's one reason we turn to this story so often. It really is a neat story about God bringing an unlikely hero a really great victory. He gets to win. And we like that story. And I don't know if it's because, particularly as young ones, we feel smaller than the world around us. But the idea of someone smaller beating someone bigger is a pretty cool idea. But that's kind of the way this goes. So, as we tell the story here in 1 Samuel chapter 17, it begins with this group of people called the Philistines. And the Philistines were not a nice group of people. They were very mean. They loved to cause problems. And they happened to live right outside of Israel. And so whenever they could, they caused problems. So they've come to battle with the Israelites, and they've got a plan. They basically say, if our best warrior can beat your best warrior, you get to be our slave. And if your best warrior can beat our best warrior, we'll be your slave. And Israel goes, okay, and then out comes Goliath. You can just kind of see the way all that unfolds there. Big giant, massive giant. We're going to talk about how big he was in a few minutes. But he's a large man. And nobody in Israel wants to fight him. Even the king, King Saul, who was head and shoulders taller than everybody else, right? He doesn't want to fight the giant. Much less does anybody who's smaller want to fight the giant. Nobody wants to fight the giant. And I think there are several reasons for that, which we'll get into later. Well, far away from this battle, Actually in the previous chapter of your Bible, we've got the story of Samuel coming and anointing David, pouring oil on his head to show that he was going to be the next king. And David's father asked him to go and take some food and some supplies to his brothers who were at that battle. And I don't know that David's father Jesse knew the details, knew about the giant. He just wanted David to go and take some supplies to his brothers. So David agrees to do that, and he bags up all the stuff, and he heads out to go and take these supplies to his brothers. But when he gets there, and he sees all what's going on, you've got Israel on one hill, and you've got the Philistines on the other hill, and several times a day a giant comes out, and he starts shouting out mean words and talking about how worthless God is, and that these are a bunch of cowards over there on the other hill, and saying all sorts of ugly things. David doesn't like it. And David starts wondering, why isn't anybody doing anything about this? Why isn't anybody going and fighting this man and shutting him up? Well, the obvious answers are, David, shut up. That's what they're saying. David, quit causing problems. His older brother says, David, you just come out here to show off. Basically, and all the other soldiers are agreeing with that. But David persists. There's no reason we should be scared of this giant. He's saying bad things about our God. Our God will defeat him. Eventually, David is taken to King Saul. And King Saul basically says, there's nothing you can do. You're a youth. You're a young man. You can't fight a seasoned giant warrior. And David says, well, I've fought off the bear. I've fought off the lion whenever it came to protecting my flock. And God has kept me safe then. My God will keep me safe now. So Saul agrees and lets him try on that armor. And it doesn't fit him. And that armor doesn't fit David at all. Actually, what the text said is not that it was too big for him, but that it was untested. It wasn't used to him. It wasn't something he wore. And so he didn't want to wear it down. But David goes down, and where this takes place, in the valley of Elah, there is a small brook that goes through, a small little river. And David goes down into that river, which would have been kind of no man's land. It would have been where nobody was supposed to go. It was between the two armies. But David goes down there, and he leans down and he grabs some stones from that brook. And he puts them into his shepherd's pouch that he has around his thighs. And he goes off and he faces this giant. And this giant laughs at him and tells him, you're nobody. There's nothing you can do to defeat me. And David says, my God can defeat you. David takes that stone, and he wraps it up in his sling, and he loosens it, and it goes up, and it hits Goliath right between the eyes, and Goliath falls down, and David wins the battle. It's a great story. It has kind of that unexpected ending. Nobody would expect David to be the victim. Nobody would expect David to win. Clearly, his brothers didn't expect him to win. And the soldiers around his brothers didn't expect David to win. And Saul didn't expect David to win. No, David's not a trained warrior as far as we know. He's a shepherd. But he's a shepherd with God on his side. And that's all day. And it's interesting to me, we don't know how large the army was there on that occasion, but of all the soldiers sitting out there, who's the only one who believed God could do this? The one who wasn't a soldier. The one who wasn't there, the one who just happened to show up. God provided a means for this. song that I love to sing. We're going to sing this, and we've got 2 verses to the song, so let's sing this together. Once was a little boy, David, down by the babbling brook. There once was a little boy, David, 5 little songs he took. One little song went into sling, sling went round and round. One little song went into sling, sling went round and round. Round and round and round and round, round and round and round. One little song went up in the air and giant came tumbling down. Boom. But that's where you do say boom. So next verse, make sure everybody says boom. For David trusted his God, and God won the battle for him. David knew his God was bigger than giants and men. He stood before Goliath, who was shouting awful words. He stood before Goliath in the name of his Lord. Round and round and round and round, round and round and round. One little stone went up in the air and giant came tumbling down. Boom! Thank you. I appreciate the boom from everybody. It really is an amazing story. That's why we love it. It's one of the big stories, right? We've got creation, we've got flood, and we've got David and Goliath. I mean, he's like the best warrior ever. And that's what I love about David. David was a man who trusted. He was a man who realized, who knew in his heart, deep down, God was bigger than anything. And that's what makes him so impressive. That becomes more impressive when you realize just how big this giant was. A couple of years ago, we had a congregation we were at in the back stairwell. So that it was the only place that was large enough and a high enough wall that we could hang it. We had a life-size depiction of Goliath. And there was another organization in town who wanted to borrow it and knew that we had it. And so it fell on me one day to go and unpack this thing from the wall. So I had to get on a stool in this back stairway, a regular height stool, and stand on my toes on the stool with a ruler trying to knock the tacks out of the top of this giant paper giant on the wall. I never really realized how large this giant was until now. I want to give you a realistic depiction of that, and I'm looking around. I need a good 6-foot tall man, if there's a 6-foot tall man. Scott coming up. I'm going to use Scott because he's particularly good on his feet, and I need him to stand on a chair on the stage to give you an idea of how big this giant really is. And I know Scott was with martial arts training and is going to tumble over on me. I want you to get an idea of how large this is. The stage itself is about 2 feet tall. Scott's about 6 feet tall. That gets him up to about 8 feet. The chair itself is going to get him right up to just under 10 feet. Now, Con, come here. Come here. You're David, of course, today. Con is right at 5 feet. And I want you to get a sense of the different sizes of these two. Who's going to win this, guys? I mean, this is a battle. We've got Con down here with a little leather strap and 5 stones and a pouch on his waist. And we got Scott with a javelin with a 15-pound iron point on the end of it. A sword decked out in armor, probably an armor bearer in front of him with a large shield protecting him. Now, with all human wisdom, who wins this battle? Goliath. Thank you for talking about this. I appreciate it. By all human reasoning, the battle goes to the giant. There was not a weapon that Con probably could use. You also take the difference in experience. I've wrestled with Con. He's not impressive. I hate to say it, he has asked me to teach him how to wrestle just so he can be the big brother. If I were to wrestle Scott, I have a feeling I'd be thoroughly embarrassed within minutes. Because Scott is trained. Scott knows how to fight. Scott has spent hour upon hour upon hour practicing moves, practicing technique, practicing skill. That's David and Goliath. Now, David had maybe trained with a sling. That was something you did when you were out in the field as a shepherd and not really able to, kind of a boring job. So you'd set up a target and you'd practice with a sling, and that was something that David had been skilled at. But David doesn't know sword play. He doesn't know how to wield a javelin, especially one that's long enough to defeat the massive spear that Goliath had. There is no human reason to believe that the small-statured little boy David could have beat the overwhelming might of Goliath. No. There was only one logical answer. David had God. And that's part of what I find so amazing about this story, is that ultimately, while we love to talk about David and Goliath, what are we really talking about when we talk about this story? God versus the might of men. That's really the discussion. I mean, the truth is, you really build the story. Goliath was a trained warrior. David merely a shepherd. Goliath was over 9 feet tall. Some people say up to 9 feet, 9 inches tall. David was a small man, probably around 5 feet. 5 to 5'3" was the average height of the Israelite at that time. So you take the fact that he's not even a full-grown man yet, probably about 17 years old. He hasn't filled out his muscles. He hasn't grown the stature of a man yet. And he's small. He's not impressive looking. Goliath is covered in armor. As far as we know, David's not wearing any armor. Goliath had not just one weapon, but multiple weapons. David had a sling. It was a weapon. Those were impressive weapons. There were whole groups of Israelites who were trained with the sling. But it's not impressive like a huge spear with a 15-foot or pound point on the end. I thought about bringing an 8-foot pole with a 15-pound weight on the end of it and see if there were any of our people in here who could hold it like a spear. You think any of us could? Nobody. Sorry, not going to happen. That's an impressive strength to be able to wield that weapon like a spear. Goliath was one of the brave among warriors. David was the only brave person among his people. Goliath trusted in his size and his strength. David trusted in someone bigger than himself. And here's where you really kind of get unexpected in the story. Saul, who was king, who was supposed to trust in God, and who was larger than all the other Israelites, did not trust in God. The way we would have expected the story to go is that Saul would have stood up and represented his people. He doesn't. And I find it particularly interesting that Saul leaves the fate of his entire army in the hands of a 17-year-old, untrained, unarmored kid. Saul's tall and experienced, yet he's cowering in his tent. You've got Saul who puts his entire country at risk on the word of the kid. He doesn't know that David's really defeated a bear and a lion. Maybe David's just being arrogant. Maybe David is just making it up. But he doesn't even know who this kid is, because after the battle is over, he has to ask, where did this kid come from? Somehow, some way, he doesn't know who this kid is, even though he's had interaction with him. David was the outcast shepherd. If you remember back when David was anointed, you remember the story? Samuel comes to the house, and he says, bring all your sons in, your family has been chosen to provide the next king. And Jesse brings all his sons in as possible next king, except for one. Who's the one he leaves out in the field? David. Not funny. David's not only merely a shepherd, he's the one who is a shepherd because he's not really counted as good for anything else. At least that seems to be the way that story reads. David's brothers were in the army. Maybe they should have stepped up. But they're cowards too. And David had more trust in God than any other person in the entire army. I find all of that to be so revealing because it contrasts David with all the rest of the people. It lets us know who David is and why God chose David above any other person. You want to know one of the reasons I think David was a man after God's own heart? It was because David realized what God was capable of. And no one else did. A couple of applications for you. One is that, and I'm making them all off of both scripture and a quote. For instance, this first one, obstacles are those frightful things you see when you take your eyes off your goal. Most of the people in Israel, what did they see in Goliath? An obstacle. What did David see? An opportunity for God to prove himself. I think that's one of the major differences between somebody who lives with fear versus somebody who lives with faith. We had a friend who the other day was wearing a shirt, and I had to buy my wife one that said, faith over fear. Isn't that a great idea? Faith over fear. The only way that happens is if you keep your eyes on the one in whom you have faith. Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. We won't read all the verses I put up here tonight. But this is a good one. And one is the good one. Therefore, since we have such a large cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us lay aside every hindrance and sin which so easily entangles us. Let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, keeping our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. For the joy that lay before him, he endured the cross, despising the shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Isn't that beautiful? Isn't that great? You fix your eyes on Jesus. Not you occasionally glance over and see, oh, okay, Jesus is still there. I think that's what we do sometimes. But that's not what it says here. Here it says, fix your eyes. Don't let them stray. Keep them on Jesus, and you will run the race with endurance. You will get away from the sin that so easily entangles us. You will be able to avoid all of the hurdles of life if you just keep your eye on Jesus. 2 Peter chapter 3, starting in verse 11. Since all these things are to be resolved in this way, talking about heaven and the earth, it is clear what sort of people you should be in holy conduct and godliness. As you wait for the day of God, as you wait for the day of God and hasten its coming, because of that day, the heavens will be dissolved with fire, and the elements will melt with heat. But based on this promise, we wait for a new heaven and a new earth where righteousness dwells. I love that. You don't just keep your eyes on Jesus. Keep your eyes on the heaven, the glorious paradise that is still ahead of us. Don't on the one who saves. Keep your eyes on the place he is taking you to. If you'll do that, you will stand up to the giant. The next quote, it's not that I'm so smart, Albert Einstein said. It's just that I stay with problems longer. Isn't that neat, Paul? As Scott would say, cool beanie. But that really is cool. That idea, sometimes our problems is we just give up quick. We give up when it gets difficult. We give up when it gets scary. We give up when the giant across the brook on the other hill is saying things we don't like and saying things that we don't know what to do with. We just sit and cower in our tent and go, I don't know what we're going to do. And God has to send a 17-year-old who's not a warrior, who's not a soldier, who doesn't have armor, doesn't have weapons of war, sends him to the front line so that he can fight the battle for me. Because I give up before I ever got started. James chapter 1, verse 12. Blessed is the one who endures trial, because when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life that God has promised for those who love him. The one who endures. Not the one who gives up. The one who sticks with it. The one who says, you know what? God's on my side. There's no giant who can stand up to me. God's got this. God will take care of me. God's going to watch over me. Even if it doesn't work out the way I want it to. We were walking in a park the other day, or yesterday, and I saw a woman with a shirt that said, even if he doesn't. You know where that phrase comes from? David Daniel and his three friends. His three friends are standing before Nebuchadnezzar, and Nebuchadnezzar is threatening them with death by burning. And they say, you know, our God, he's big enough to get us out of this. But even if he doesn't, we will not betray him and bow down to your holy image. That's three men who are willing to stay with the problem until the solution to this. Did they get thrown in the furnace? Absolutely. You think that was pleasant? As far as we know, one way or the other, they didn't even come out none of that smoke, right? Again, that had to be fearful, but those were three men who were willing to act with faith over fear. David was able to act with faith over fear. Why? Because he knew God had it. So he kept enduring and stayed with it. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 36. For you need endurance, so that after you have done what is God's will, you may receive what is promised. What we need to do sometimes is just determine to do God's will. And I know there are many of us who do. There are representatives here in this room of men and women who have stuck with God year in and year out for a lifetime. And that's amazing. That's amazing. Again, I think sometimes it's easier to look back at the years and say we've been faithful than it is the days. Isn't it? There are days when we mess up, but overall we do fairly well. I think God recognizes that. And God's saying, you know what? Just stick with it. Stay with me. I like the way Michael Jordan worded it. Obstacles don't have to stop you. If you run into a wall, don't turn and give up. Figure out how to climb it, go through it, or work around it. One of my favorite children's books is called We're Going on a Bear Hunt. And that every single obstacle they come to water, they come to a fork, they come to some icky, sticky mud, they come to all these different obstacles. And it says, well, we can't go over it, we can't go under it. Oh no, God will get you through it. Next quote by Zig Ziglar is one of my favorites. Don't be distracted by criticism. Remember, the only taste of success some people have is when they think, I know you. Isn't that great? It's true. It's true. The Bible talks a lot about criticism and people criticizing others. And the fact that we are guilty of criticizing and biting and devouring one another. And that the world is going to criticize us. And the world is going to find ways to try to bring us down and make us upset. Paul tells Titus, your message is to be sound beyond reproach, so that any opponent will be ashamed because he doesn't have anything bad to say about it. Isn't that exactly what Zig was saying? You stick with it. You say the right things. You do the right things. You do the stuff that God says you should do, and God will carry you through it. Don't worry about everybody. They will be proven wrong by your ability to stick with what you know you should do. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 16. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 16. Here it says, yet do this with gentleness and respect, keeping a clear conscience, so that when you are accused, those who disparage your good conduct in Christ Jesus will be put to shame. Now notice, it doesn't say, if you are accused, if you are disparaged. You know, there are going to be people who criticize you for doing the right thing. And if you don't believe it, Jesus never did the wrong thing and he was killed. You're going to get accused. You're going to get falsely accused. And you carry on doing the right thing because that's how God will protect you. One more. Whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're right. Another right. And again, that's just one of those principles that's true about us. And I think that's probably the bigger battle that most of us face. Most of us face not necessarily criticism from the outside. Most of us face more internal criticism. We beat ourselves up more than anyone else does. We look in the mirror and we don't like what stares back. We think about how we handled something, and then we sit there and pick apart all the things we did wrong, instead of just knowing that if we do it God's way, we'll do it all right. Proverbs chapter 14, verse 12, there's a way that seems right to a person, but its end is the way of sin. Jeremiah 10, verse 23 says something similar. It basically says, there's a way I know, Lord, that a person's way of life is not his own. No one who walks determines his own step. Where we fall guilty sometimes is that we think that we have to figure out life on our own. And we think that we have to face all those giants on our own. And we have to face the criticism on our own. We have to face the obstacles on our own. And we have to go and hear all of that garbage and face all of the world on our own. And when we feel that way, we get discouraged. We wonder why we feel depressed. And we wonder why we feel burdened. And we wonder why we feel overwhelmed. I'll be honest. And I can only talk about myself. I'll talk about myself. There's a lot of times when I find myself much more like King Saul in the tent than David picking up stones in the wood. A lot of times. Where I walk out and I see that giant across the hill and he's massive compared to any of my soldiers. And I turn around and walk back in the tent and go, I don't know how in the world we're going to do this. This is too tough. It's too difficult. There's no way we're going to do it. And if I'm Saul, I'm sitting there beating myself up. Why did I agree to a one-on-one battle? A one-on-one battle. Either I go out there and lose it for everybody, or I send some other soldier out there, and then I'm in trouble for sending somebody who is incapable, and he loses, and we all become like, I mean, this is all my fault. What's awesome about 1 Samuel chapter 17 is that God is teaching us in this story. That's not the way to live life. The way to live life is to trust that we have a God who is big enough to defeat our giants for us. We have a God who is big enough to hold us up and lift us up and protect us and guide the stone when we let it loose and make it most effective so that you can run over to the other hill and you can pick up that massive sword and you can cut off the giant's head, because that's what David does. That's what God wants to do. More often than not, I stand in God's way. When the truth is, what I need to do is step aside and let God win. There's a song that has resonated with the world, and it's a Bible-based song, or this Christian ideas type song. It's called "You Say" by Lauren Day. Probably many of you have heard it. And I have an acapella version, and I thought about just having us sing it tonight, and I thought maybe we'll wait on that. But I do want to read the words to you, because the words just go so well with what we're talking about here. I keep fighting voices in my mind that say I'm not enough. Every single lie that tells me I will never measure up. Am I more than just the sum of every high and every low? Remind me once again just who I am, because I need to know. The only thing that matters now is everything you think of me. In you, I find my worth. In you, I find my identity. Taking all I have and now I'm laying it at your feet. You'll have every failure, God. You'll have every victory. You say I am loved when I can't feel a thing. You say I am strong when I can't, or when I think I am weak. You say I am held when I am falling short, when I don't belong. Oh, you say I am yours, and I believe. I believe what you say to me. I believe. I think that song has resonated with our culture and with our world, because we live in a world of people who no longer believe in self. And the world has told them for decades, you've got to do it all yourself. You've got to be independent. You've got to make your own way. You've got to go and accomplish things. You've got to build this life for yourself. And what we're realizing more and more is that a life we build for ourselves isn't worth a lot. But a life that is built with God, when God says we're worth something, when God puts value in us, then we need something. And that's what I love about David and Goliath, is that David didn't go before Goliath arrogantly bragging about what he could accomplish. He didn't go before Goliath and talk about how he could defeat the giant. He again and again said, my God can defeat you. And I certainly hope all of us will look at life and say the same thing. When we're facing obstacles, when we're facing hardship, when we're facing discouragement, instead of saying we'll get out of it by our own strength, we look at those obstacles and we say, God can defeat you. And then they do it. Then we toss that stone up in the air and get started. Because God is going to get it. It's a great story. It's not just a kid. giant came tumbling down. Boom! And I kind of feel like that needs to be our mantra sometimes. We just need to go through life, and when we face an obstacle, we slap our hands together and go, boom! Got it. Because that kind of confidence is going to get it. If you're not a child of God, I tell you, there's no greater place to be than with God. Because with God, you win. With God, you experience victory. With God, you can get somewhere. With God, you can face the obstacles of life and they come down. It doesn't matter if they're massive and tall and strong and trained. With God, you win. So I encourage you, if you're not a child of God, if you don't have Him on your side, tonight's the night to make that. Tonight's the night to follow Him, let Him be in control, let Him take care of you. If you need the invitation to get your life right,